Well, if you were with us last week, you'll know that we celebrated Good Shepherd Sunday. That Sunday, every fourth Sunday of the year in Easter season, when we spend some time with one of Jesus' favourite metaphors for himself, the shepherd. We talked about how there's a lot of love for this image of Christ in the church, isn't there? The charming, romantic vision of Jesus tending to his flock. But of course, what we didn't talk about is that if Jesus is a shepherd, what does that make us? Right, which isn't quite as charming and romantic, is it? But to be honest, as you read the Gospels and you pay attention to the ways that Jesus describes his disciples, you find that calling them sheep is probably one of the more polite ones. And it's consistent with the ways that Jesus often describes the kind of life to which he calls his followers. Well, if you thought that calling a sheep was offensive enough, I think in many ways today's text is even worse. Because today we are not sheep, but branches. Mindless, senseless, unsentient beings, literally blocks of wood, and entirely dependent upon God. You get the point. Jesus often depicts the life of a disciple in terms of dependence, of need and reliance. That, I think, is at the heart of the sheep and the shepherd image from last week. But with today's text, Jesus goes further. A branch is not only dependent upon the vine, but maybe more intimately is united with it, is one with it. This is a picture not just of dependence, but of union. The biblical scholar Thomas Brody suggests that the fundamental theme that John wants to get across in his gospel, the beating heart of John's theology, is what Brody calls abiding, restful union. You see it first right at the beginning in John 1. The prologue of John speaks of Jesus being close to the Father's heart. This beautiful picture of the Father and the Son in Trinitarian union, abiding in love, before that love explodes into the creation of all things. And then throughout the Gospel, Jesus speaks again and again about his union with God, which the Pharisees don't much like. I and the Father are one, he says. And it's that claim that ultimately lands Jesus in trouble. And then at the Last Supper, the night before he dies, we have this intimate picture of one of the disciples, someone who in John's Gospel is simply called the Beloved, reclining against Jesus' chest. It harkens back to that picture of Jesus and God at the beginning of the Gospel. Clearly, something about this picture of union, of intimacy, is really key to John's Gospel. Brody concludes that what John's trying to tell us is that the life to which Christ calls those who follow him is not a life that makes you more independent, smarter, stronger, richer, but a life of deep, abiding dependence upon the grace of God in Christ. This conflicts with the ways of being that are often celebrated in our world, doesn't it? We're coded from day one to value independence, to pursue the way of the self-made man and woman. That vision is a myth that covers over the truth at the heart of what it is to be human, that we are all deeply dependent. We're dependent on one another, right from the minute we enter into life. We're dependent on systems and institutions that keep us healthy and safe and fed. We're dependent on our own very precarious health and well-being, mental, physical, spiritual. We're dependent on the complex climate systems of our fragile planet. And we tend to pay very little attention to all of these things until, of course, they start to malfunction. At which time we realize that our myth of independence is just that, a myth. Each of us can call to mind moments in our lives when we found ourselves reminded of this. Moments of insecurity, disability, loneliness, loss. Or in the world beyond our walls, moments marked by war and conflict, by injustice and oppression. But because we're so coded to value our independence and agency, to predicate our entire sense of worth and identity upon it, it's natural that this myth weaves its way into our faith. You don't have to look very far to find those who will peddle faith and spirituality as a kind of commodity in the marketplace of individual self-betterment. I sometimes wonder if we tend to equate faith with a desire to become a better version of ourselves, as if spirituality is a means to more and better control of our lives, the ability to exercise agency over who we are, what we become, what life gives back to us. On the night before he dies, Jesus calls his disciples together and he lays out to them in uncharacteristic clarity what's about to happen to them. This is a picture of suffering and death, of Jesus giving himself over in complete dependence to the violence of others. And with that picture starkly in their mind, he offers them a new vision of what it is to follow. He says, "I am the vine, you are the branches. Abide in me as I abide in you. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love." Against the myth of independence and agency, Jesus offers another vision. The way of Jesus, he says, is not the way of a pursuit of self-betterment. That perhaps is a happy byproduct, but rather it is the way of abiding, restful union, of allowing the love of God in Christ to transform us into the way of love and service to others. It radically resists the cult of independence, and it gives dignity and worth and value to our dependence upon one another, upon our planet, upon God. The goal we strive towards is not the self-made hero standing on his success, but a picture of a God who empties God's self even to the point of death in order to win the world in love. That challenges what we think our faith is all about, what the end and goal of following Jesus is, doesn't it? I mean, if someone were to ask you, what's the point of following Jesus, of being Christian, of gathering at the table with Christ and community, what would you say? Is it to become a better version of myself? To be a better, nicer Adam? I think John challenges that. The life to which Christ calls those who would follow him is a life that makes sense of our deep dependence. And I wonder if because of that, Christians should be known in the world for how they give worth and dignity to those corners of our lives and our world that are often left out of the spotlight, that are left out of the myth of independence. Christians are a people who recognize the deep grace hidden in need. That's why Jesus says that in the upside-down economy of God, blessed are the poor, the meek, the mourning, the persecuted. Blessed are the ignored and the lonely. Blessed are the ones who cannot help themselves. For our dependence is the truest thing about us, the means of grace in our lives, and the place from which our loving service to others springs. As John says in another letter of his that we heard a moment ago, God is love, and those who abide in love abide in God, and God abides in them. Thanks be to God.